أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وأفضل الصلاة والتسليم على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. واللعنة الدائمة الأبدية على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Holy Quran, and what He states is the truth in the chapter of Al-Isra, chapter 17, verse 71. Allah says, يَوْمَ نَدْعُو كُلَّ أُنَاسٍ بِإِمَامِهِمْ. Allah says in this verse, He says, on the day that we call every people by their Imam. فَمَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ بِيَمِينِهِ. As for those who come with their books in their right hands, فَأُولَٰئِكَ يَقْرَؤُونَ كِتَابَهُمْ وَلَا يُظْلَمُونَ فَتِيلًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for those are the ones that will read their books, their book of deeds, and they will not be oppressed at all. صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight's topic is whether we need a marjaa or not. Now, in order to understand this topic, and it is a very important topic, it's an important topic because it goes into the very core of our belief system. Meaning that in order for me to know the information, I have to go back to someone. If I want to know what Allah wants of me, then in this day and time I have to go back to the experts. So we need to prove that point. We'll look at it logically. We'll go through an intellectual discourse, inshallah. And then we'll tackle the situation through history. We'll go back to some hadiths also, inshallah. And through that we'll be able to understand whether we truly do need a marjaa, meaning someone to follow, or not. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, intellectually speaking, going back to experts is something we do on a daily basis. Whether it's when we first start going to kindergarten and we have our kindergarten teachers who are experts in their field, or we go into elementary school and our teachers are experts in their field that have been certified by the Board of Education and have had, a period of their practicum where they practiced how to be good teachers, and they shadowed good teachers in order to learn how to become good teachers. Or whether it's in high school when our teachers also are certified teachers that have been qualified and chosen by that school and by the Board of Education to lead the classes in that specific field. Or whether it's in university where our professors are ones that are experts in their own right, whether in their research or whether in their other work, academically speaking, meaning their writings. Now, this necessity for the expert is one that the rational mind concludes is something that truly is necessary. Why? Because it prevents us from falling into error. And it also helps us to be able to get the information from the source, right? Meaning that if I, for example, want to go and diagnose an illness that I have, right? I don't go to a cow herder or a sheep herder, right? Or do I? I don't, right? If I want to, for example, if I have a cold, do I go to a veterinary doctor? No. If I have a cold, do I go to a dentist? No. I go to a doctor, right? A family doctor. Now, if, let's say, for example, la samhallah, I end up getting a really terrible disease that family doctor can't, he doesn't have the expertise to help me with or to diagnose, what does he do? He refers me to someone who's an expert in the field, such as an ENT doctor, ear, nose, and throat, because I might have a sinus problem or something like that, right? So even the experts recognize that there are others who have greater expertise in certain fields than they do, correct? Now, the question is, how is it, and what is the process through which we determine today, academically speaking, that someone is an expert in their field? So, if you go to university, when you're in university, the teachers who are teaching you, right, have teacher's assistants, correct? TAs, correct? Now the TAs, you know, aren't experts in their field, but you know they're students and they're being trained or supervised by your prof, correct? Now, here's what's interesting. When you graduate with a bachelor's degree, are you considered an expert in your field? The answer is no, exactly. When you do your master's degree, are you considered an expert in your field? Getting there, not yet, right? But once you do a PhD, are you considered an expert in your field? Somewhat. Not yet. Right? Why? Because above the level of a PhD are all those associate professors and professors above them, right? So once you get your PhD, you're being supervised not by another PhD, but by an associate professor or a professor. Now, in order for one to become a PhD, he has to be supervised by either an associate professor or a professor. And that associate professor usually has to have a certain interest in a specific field of research that is extremely specific, and he has to produce, or she has to produce, a certain number of papers or research that have to be published in order for them to qualify to be in that position for them to supervise you. So let's say now we're in our PhD, right? So we present our research under the supervision for, the past, I think it takes 5 years to get a PhD, 5 to 7 years, right? During that time, you are supervised by that one associate professor or the professor above them. Now, once you get to the point where you're done your research, what you do is you have to stand in defense of the research that you've done. You're still not a PhD, right? So after the 5 years or the 7 years, you stand in front of a board, and that board, what they do is they literally take your research apart. That's what you've presented, this, 1,000 pages or 500 pages of research over the span of the 5 or 7 years. You're sitting in front of a panel, and what they're telling you is what's wrong with it and what you need to fix and so on and so forth. But they're all peers, they're all professors. Now what happens then is if they like your work, they'll ask you to make a few changes. Once you make the changes, what ends up happening, right? Then you become a PhD officially. Before that, you are a PhD candidate. After 7 years or 5 years, you're still a PhD candidate, right? But then once they say these experts who are profs, they say, oh, this is good enough to be published, then after you make those changes, it's accepted, you become a PhD. But are you a prof once you get a PhD? No, you're not. You're not a professor. Actually, after you get your PhD, there's another level of postgraduate studies where if you're interested in continuing, what would happen is you would have to generate more research under that associate professor or that professor. And as you generate more research and you become more well-known in that area of research and more well-published, what ends up happening is that then they may decide, if you have enough good research, they may decide to recommend you for the position of associate professor. And who's they? They're a panel of experts who are profs themselves. You see? Now, let's say they do recommend you, you go in front of a panel, they see all of your research, and then they determine, yes, truly, we believe he's at the level of associate professor. Now you become no longer, well, actually, you were an associate professor candidate, right? Then you become an associate professor. So you become an associate professor candidate when your supervisor applies for you to become an associate professor. Then you have to run through your research a few more years with them, and they determine, yes, this person is associate professor material. Now they slap on behind your name, associate professor. Sounds very, very tedious, doesn't it, right? And very meticulous system. Then after that, after researching some more, getting published some more, showing your expertise some more, now your level of expertise goes to the level of your professor. Right? That's when what your professor will do is they'll present your work in front of a panel and they'll recommend you to become a professor. It's a long, arduous process. My father had to go through it. Right? And then what ends up happening after that? Then you sit in front of a panel and they look at your research and they say, okay, now you're a professor candidate. You research some more, right? And then finally, after a few years, they decide, you know what? This man's done enough work, or this woman's done enough work. They've put in their time, and therefore now they're deserving of the title of professor. Okay, so in the Islamic seminary, the system is no different. And actually, we'll start back from the time of Prophet Muhammad first, okay? So, you know, the system of emulation in Islam isn't one that started today or just with the greater occultation. It actually existed from the time of the Prophet and even before. The prophets themselves were emulated, right? So when the prophets would come and they would tell the people about the revelation, then what would people do? They would take their information directly from Allah or take it from the prophet themselves? From the prophet, right? Am I right or no? Yes or no? Right. So the prophet then becomes who they follow, correct? In order to learn what Allah wants of them. Now these prophets, many of them had disciples. These disciples were grand scholars. They were taught by the prophet himself. So people, when they wanted to get their information, if the prophet isn't there, who would they go to? They'd go to the apostles or the disciples. Make sense? So they would become their source of information. They would emulate what they would tell them to do, and based on that, they would know that they fulfilled their religious requirements as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for them to do. Now, during the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, this train-the-trainer system, where you have one trainer who trains a bunch of master trainers, right? What did Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam do? He trained Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. Ahsant, salawat. So Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, when the Prophet would receive the revelation, who would write down the revelation? Ali ibn Abi Talib salamullahi alayhi. When the exegesis, the explanation of the verse would come down, who would write the exegesis? Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. He actually had a sahifa called Sahifat Ali that's 100 arm lengths long. It's a scroll made out of camel hide. It's called Sahifat Ali ibn Abi Talib. This is a book that has the tafsir of the entire Quran and has all of the ahkam, all of the rules that we would want to know. Now, who was the one that people would go to if Prophet Muhammad wasn't there? Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. But who else? Was there someone who wasn't infallible? Well, let's see. There were several companions who were known to be close to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. For example, Ammar ibn Yasir, Kumayl ibn Ziyad, Abu Dhar, right? Al-Miqdad, سلمان لا تقولوا سلمان الفارسي قولوا سلمان المحمدي سلمان منا أهل البيت صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. So Salman, the Persian who Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam elevated to the level of Ahl al-Bayt alayhim afdal as-salatu was-salam, such that he said, do not say Salman the Persian, say Salman the Muhammadan, for Salman is of us, O Ahl al-Bayt. Notice these master trainers. Now, okay, you say, this was in the time of Prophet Muhammad, but what about after? Well, in the time of Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, it wasn't any different, right? In the time of Imam al-Hasan, Imam al-Hussein, it wasn't any different. Let's move forward in time because we're short on time, right? Let's move forward to the time of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq and Imam al-Baqir alayhim as-salam. Okay? So after the tragedy of Karbala, after Imam al-Sajjad, Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. So Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhim afdal as-salatu was-salam, there's this great narration by Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, a sahiha, meaning a correct hadith, by way of Jamil ibn Darraj. That Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, it's reported that he said, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. He said, Bashir al-mukhbitina bil-jannah. Bear glad tidings to those who have been given great news that they are of the people of heaven. Who are they? Burayd ibn Muawiyah al-Ajli, wa Aba Basir, Layth ibn al-Bukhtari al-Muradi, wa Muhammad ibn Muslim, wa Zurara. أربعة نجباء. So here he mentions how many names? He mentions Burayd ibn Muawiyah al-Ajli. He mentions Abu Basir. We all know Abu Basir. Prophet Muhammad named him Abu Basir, right? Because he was blind, but he had a lot of insight. So he's one of the great companions. Also Muhammad ibn Muslim, who was a companion of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq, and was known to be a Marjaa in the city of Kufa because he studied under whom? Under Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Ja'far. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. And also, who else do we have? We have Zurara, one of the greatest companions of Imam al-Sadiq salamullahi alayhi. So, Arba'atu Nujaba, he says, these are four chosen ones. They are the protectors of the halal and the haram. He says they are the protectors of the halal and the haram, of the ahkam, of the Islamic laws. And he says, وَلَوْلَا هَؤُلَاء. He says, and if it wasn't for these, لَنْقَطَعَتْ آثَارُ النُّبُوَّةِ وَانْدَرَسَتْ. Then the legacy, the heritage of our prophets would have been completely cut off. We would have never received it. This is how important these Marjaa are. Let's go forward a little. Before we go forward, let me tell you a hadith before we go forward about Zurara, since we mentioned Zurara. A man comes from Damascus. He wants to debate with Imam al-Sadiq alayhi afdal salatu wassalam. So he approaches the Imam al-Sadiq. He says, I am here, I've traveled a long way to debate with you. He says to him, alayka bi Zurara. He says, go to Zurara. In ghalabtahu ghalabtani. If you beat him, then you've beaten me. He says, and when you're done, alayka bi akhihi Himran. Once you're done, go to his brother Himran. So this is even in the presence of the Imam salamullahi alayhi. He's authenticating. So just like Prophet Muhammad authenticated Salman, right? Just as he authenticated the rest of his companions, and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salamullahi alayhi is authenticating Zurara. Just as he authenticated Muhammad ibn Muslim and Burayd ibn Muawiyah al-Ajli and Layth ibn al-Bukhtari al-Muradi, Abu Basir. Now what was he doing? He was setting a precedent. He was saying, look, even in my time, even with me here, you can go to this jurist that I trained, that I authenticated, that I certified to get your information. For he is, and he said it, he said, أَفْقَهُكُمْ Zurara. Why? He says, because he is the most knowledgeable of all of you. So then that means the intellectual necessity to go to the expert, to go to the most knowledgeable is very, very important. Therefore the Imam salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, he tells me to do that. And then he says, listen, after him, go to the next knowledgeable after him. Who? His brother Himran. Let's move forward. Al-Imam al-Hadi, salamullahi alayhi. What does he say? He says, Uthman ibn Sa'id Al-Amari thiqati, man akhadha anhu akhadha anni. He says, Uthman ibn Sa'id is my trustworthy. He who takes from him has taken from me. We move forward to Imam Al-Hasan Al-Askari salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. He says, Muhammad ibn Uthman, he says, Uthman wabnuhu, his name is Muhammad ibn Uthman. Muhammad, he says, Uthman وابنه ثقتاي من أخذ عنهما فقد أخذ عني. So he says, these two, Uthman and his son Muhammad, they are my two trustworthies. He who takes from them has taken from me. Come to the time of Imam al-Hujjah, Ajallah Ta'ala Farajahu al-Sharif. Right? Imam al-Hujjah had 4 ambassadors, 4 emissaries, right? People would communicate to the Imam through him, through this ambassador, and then he would bring the answers called tawqi'at, meaning letters that he actually answered questions. He answered the questions in a letter form, or if he had like a press release, for example, right? The Imam salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi would write this letter, give it to his emissary, and he would deliver it to the people. He had 4. He had Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amari, the first one that the Imam al-Hadi mentioned. And then he had Muhammad ibn Uthman after him, the son of Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amari. And then he had Al-Hasan ibn Ruh al-Nawbakhti. And then after Al-Hasan ibn Ruh al-Nawbakhti, he had Al-Samari. Now, the last letter that would come out, Al-Imam al-Hujjah salamullahi alayhi, he says, وَأَمَّا في الحوادث الواقعة فارجعوا فيها إلى رواة حديثنا فإنهم حجتي عليكم وأنا حجة الله عليهم. He says, and as for new occurrences, new questions that you have, new issues that you have, then you are to go back to those who are the narrators of our hadiths. For they are our proof, they are my proof upon you, and I am Allah's proof upon them. So now we ask, who are ruwat hadithina? Who are they? Right? And what does the term ruwat mean? Is it anybody who narrates a hadith? Is it me, for example? I got up here, I told you a few hadiths? No. Ruwat al-hadith are like at the level of Zurara, for example. They are the ones that have permission. They are the ones that are authenticated and certified, just as we had that system of authentication and certification, right? The academic system, those are the ones that were authenticated and certified by the Imam or by the student of the Imam, such as Zurara, or by the student of the student of the Imam, such as the Sheikh al-Mufid, or by the student of the student of the student of the Imam, such as the Sharif al-Murtada and the Sharif al-Radi and the Sheikh al-Tusi, and so forth, right? And so if we want to know who are the ones that are authenticated, what we have to ask for is a letter of certification. The letter of certification states who that person is certified by, on the authority or by the authority of whom. And that person has to be certified by those before him. Meaning who? Let's go back to the academic system. Here I am, I'm in the Hawza today, right? I study in the seminary. I finish my muqaddimat, my intro level classes. Does that make me a marja' like if I finished my bachelor's? No, right? So I study in my sutuh level, which is the second level of the seminary studies, right? Let's say that's my master's level. I study like 3 years of that as an example. Am I an expert in my field? Not really, not yet, okay? Then I study some more at a PhD level, right? Where I finish my sutuh level. I'm at the top level of my sutuh and I finished. That's the intermediate, second level, okay? And I get certified by my teachers and examined that I finished that level. Am I considered a marja' yet? No, I'm not. Can I be followed by people? No, I'm not. But I can direct people in terms of, who to follow. I have certain knowledge. I know how the system works, so I can help you with that, for example. Then I go into another level, which is called Bahth al-Kharij, which is like postgraduate studies, right? This is where, after the PhD, I start doing what? I start working really hard on proving myself in the derivation of Islamic laws. But I need supervisors above me, right? I'm still not an associate professor. I might be an assistant to an associate professor. As I do more research, prove myself more, an associate professor will recommend me to my professor. And he'll say, listen, this guy's done a lot of research. I think he could be a good candidate to be an associate professor. Okay, to be at that level, right? A higher level. meaning there's a beginner level of ijtihad, right? Where I learn how to derive Islamic laws. Once I learn how to derive the Islamic laws at a certain level, I keep working on it and keep working on it under greater supervision. And then they say, the peers get together and they say, well, you know what? This guy's at the level of associate professor now. That's fine, we've tested him, right? Next thing you know, I work even harder and harder, and now the top level Marjaa are noticing me, they're noticing what I'm doing, they're seeing my research, I'm going back and forth with them, right, as well as with their top students, you see, and then I'm being authenticated more and more, such that people know who I am in the Hawza now. They know my knowledge based on my attendance and my participation in my classes with the Marjaa, as well as what? As well as my publications. I might be writing down the notes of their classes, having them check the notes, and so forth. Then, at a certain level, they determine I'm a professor, meaning I am a mujtahid, meaning I'm a jurist, but I'm still a beginner, still learning, right? Then, once I prove that I can derive laws in all books of fiqh, of jurisprudence, then what happens? Then, my teachers, the top level Marjaa, will say to me what? Now you are qualified to be followed. You are considered an absolute mujtahid. Meaning what? You are able to derive Islamic laws in all books of law. Very good? And what do? They write me a letter, a certificate that says, by the permission I got by my teacher, who is so-and-so, who is also an absolute jurist, who was certified by this absolute jurist by name, up until you get to al-ghayba, to the time of the occultation, right? There's this whole chain of permissions, you see? And so this person who has this certificate of ijtihad is exactly the type of person I want to choose to be followed. Why? Because he is the most knowledgeable in the books of law, of Islamic law. So the question is, do I need a marja then? Did the imams have marajah for me to follow if I lived in their time and I lived in another area? Muhammad ibn Muslim was the marja of Kufa, right? You see what I'm saying? So the answer is, of course I do. If I want to know exactly what Allah wants of me, based on the teachings of the Prophet and the imams, then I must go back to these marajah who are experts in deriving the laws, reading the hadiths, explaining the Holy Quran, and therefore based on that they are the protectors of the religion, just as وَبَشِّرُ الْمُخْبِتِينَ بِالْجَنَّةِ in that hadith by Jamil ibn Darraj. And bear glad tidings to those who have been given news that they deserve heaven. Why? Because they are the protectors of the religion. If it wasn't for them, then all of the legacy of the prophets would have been cut off from us. Therefore, these marajah are very important. They have to be certified. They must have a paper of certification in order for me to say, oh yes, this is a marja of emulation. He is a resource for me, a source for me to follow. And based on that then, yes, I do need a marja. Why? Because just like in that first verse that I mentioned, where Allah says, يَوْمَ نَدْعُو كُلَّ أُنَاسٍ بِإِمَامِهِمْ, on the day of judgment we shall call every people by the imam they followed. So if you followed an imam of evil, a leader in evil, then what will happen? You'll follow him, he'll be your marja, and you'll end up in hell just like him. But if you followed an imam, a leader who is certified and has the certification up to the imams themselves, up to al-ghayba, then what happens? Then I know I'm getting the right information. My responsibility is completely fulfilled in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and inshaAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He says, وَلَا يُظْلَمُونَ فَتِيلًا, in the last part of that verse, and they shall not be oppressed one iota, not even a bit. They'll end up in heaven, inshaAllah. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to realize the imam that we must follow, the imam of our time. For surely this system of marja'iyah is a system that's there to protect the knowledge of Ahl al-Bayt and divine knowledge, and therefore it is one that I have to tap into. It is one that is intellectually a necessity for me to follow. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brightens my path and your path, so that we stay on the straight path towards following the right leadership, as well as those who represent our imam of this time. We ask that Allah hastens His appearance inshaAllah and makes us of His servants. بحق محمد وآل محمد. هذا والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. والفاتحة على أرواح المرحومين.